After a long layover, it is time for Chronicles of Darkness, so welcome one and all to this video on the Covenants of Vampire the Requiem. It is said that you can choose your friends, but you can't choose your family. Well, if the clans are your family, then the Covenants are your friends, inasmuch as vampires can be said to have friends. Covenants are associations, vampires of similar interest, philosophy, and disposition. 2 covenants are largely secular in outlook and purpose, 2 more are esoteric in their goals, and the 5th dedicated to overcoming the vampiric condition. But without further ado, a long-ass video about the Covenants of Vampire the Requiem. The Carthian Movement. The Carthian Movement is the new kindred on the block of the Dance Macabre, dedicated to democracy and unity through strength. A collective fist to smash the antiquated structures that deprive younger and idealistic kindred of the power of self-determination. And since the kindred have managed to succeed where the baby boomers failed, there are more neonates than there are elders, which means the Carthians have a large pool of powerless, idealistic, and most importantly, gullible young vampires to ply with delusions of grandeur and freedom. What defines the Carthians is their love of what they believe to be novel ideas. They have visions of kindred self-rule, ideas that they enjoy expounding at length. The idea that the current state of kindred affairs' longevity might be evidence of its legitimacy or utility is dismissed out of hand by the Carthians, who maintain that they know better and that their ideas would be better for all if only they were given a chance. But those wretched elders just insist on keeping them down and fighting inevitable change, which is why, in some Carthian groups, elders, and even ancilla, are not permitted to join. Don't trust anyone over 30, man. Then again, what self-respecting elder would join the Carthians? The elders waited their turn, they played the game, and the neonates can do the same. But the elders are not content to wait and let the Carthians collapse under the weight of their own foolish beliefs, and direct some of their power towards hastening the young Covenant's downfall. However, the movement, despite lacking experience, do have a few sharp minds in their ranks, who have managed to preserve the movement against the elders' machinations. These cooler heads have navigated the Dance Macabre, exploited the unforced errors of other covenants, and managed to play the long game. Democracy is not necessarily a popular idea among kindred, and it falls prey easily to factionalism and infighting, as among mortals. But for the Carthians, they learn that sticking together gets them more than fighting separately. The Carthians are not only the youngest covenant, but most of its members are neonates, with a few ancilla who came of age in the covenant, or who are wily enough to enter the movement's ranks. There may even be a handful of Carthian elders, who largely keep their age and power to themselves. The most radical Carthians regard the movement as a potential tool for peaceful relations between kindred and mortal, though few openly speak of dispensing with the masquerade. The Carthians reflexively oppose the status quo of kindred society, even as they acknowledge that vampires have a long-standing set of traditions and unique history. The Carthians do not regard either as being inherently worthy of deference. Instead, the movement stands by the idea that every person deserves to have a voice in their rule, which usually means vampire democracy, or vampire socialism. I'm not sure vampires have the same need for the means of production as mortals, but I'm sure I just need to read more theory. The Carthians' notion of egalitarianism places them at odds with pretty much every other covenant who claim power through divine mandate, libido dominandi, spiritual advancement, or self-mastery. But Carthians, like their mortal counterparts, regard their criticism of other vampire covenants as a preface to their destruction, that of the old order and the old world, which must be swept away and replaced with the new and better world, for the good of all kindred. Very Bakuninist sentiment. The Carthians abhor stagnation. They believe that it is crucial for them, and by extension all vampires, to change with the times. Full of all the self-assuredness of youthful enthusiasm, they believe their young eyes can see the truth of kindred nature, and that the elders are blinkered by age and fear of what is new. Of course, the Carthians are not content to wait for history to progress, and so, whenever possible, they give it, and whoever happens to be standing atop of it, a helpful shove into the dustbin. The Carthians do not observe rituals as other covenants understand them, particularly the mystically inclined ones, but they do have certain political activities they regard with certain solemnity. One such is the chain, a symbolic passing of some significant item between members of a Carthian coterie or domain, indicating that an act which touches one touches all. The chain may follow or precede a Carthian gathering. Depending on the locality of the Carthian movement, its members will observe that country's Independence Day, or a day of significance to the Carthian vision of independence and democracy for all kindred. The Carthians may not be able to grill and drink, but they are known to get wild and unruly on Independence Day. Now, the movement doesn't pay much mind to titles. However, there are two which are universal to the Covenant. The first is that of the Prefect. It is an elected post, usually by simple majority. The Prefect is equal parts spokesman, PR rep, shop steward, and committee chairperson. They are responsible for keeping the movement organized and protected, whether from outsiders or by the actions of other Carthians. The other important Carthian post is that of the Myrmidon. The Myrmidon functions as something between a mediator and a sergeant-at-arms. Ideally, the Prefect and the Myrmidon work closely together, but the Myrmidon is not the Prefect's subordinate. Their duties involve in settling disputes between Carthian kindred and occasionally between Carthians and outsiders. As such, the Myrmidon must maintain at least the appearance of neutrality, if not impartiality. The Circle of the Crone. The Circle of the Crone believes that vampires have, in some form or another, always been in the world. Monsters of fear and myth, beasts emerging from the dark to claim what was due to them, performing dark miracles through blood and sacrifice, sometimes feared as demons, worshipped as gods, or occasionally as both. The Acolytes also believe that they are not truly condemned to stasis, but that it is possible to change. To the Acolytes, damnation is not the final word of a vampire's existence. Anyone, kindred or not, can obtain great power if they are willing to commit themselves to gaining it, and sacrificing their weakness for its sake. This standpoint has led to the Circle of the Crone gaining some strange bedfellows, mortals, spirits, even werewolves and mages. Because of this tendency, the Circle of the Crone often finds itself at cross purposes with the Lancea Sanctum and the Invictus, who regard the masquerade as sacrosanct. Some domains have even outlawed the presence of the Acolytes in their practices, though rooting out such heresy is often more trouble than it's worth. The Circle of the Crone claims a large cross-section of vampires from the clans of all ages, though the Gangrel are probably the best represented of the clans, while the Ventru generally do not find the Covenant suitable to their interests. Despite the Acolytes' secrecy, they are very interested in gathering new members, especially from among the Unaligned. The Crone, around whom the Circle built its beliefs, is more metamyth, a vampire-like being manifesting as spirits, gods, and sorcerers across geography and history, though there are some acolytes who insist that there is actually a singular Crone, a grand founder in the same sense as Longinus of the Lancea Sanctum and Dracula of the Ordo Dracul. Regardless, the Circle believes that the Crone was a Lilith Prometheus figure who was exiled from the company of the gods and sought forbidden knowledge, either before or after said exile, then spread that knowledge to her followers. The means through which the Crone acquired the secrets of creation were suffering and endurance. The Acolytes seek to walk in the Crone's footsteps and attain similar power through similar methods. The Circle of the Crone venerates the natural world, but understand that they are separated from it by the embrace. They are trapped in stasis, unable to bring forth new life, only to spread death. Destruction is not true power, creation is, and it is the only way that the undead can retain their connection to the natural world. The Acolytes attempt to play a role in creation through horticulture or husbandry, while others turn their attention to art and invention. Even if the cultists cannot truly create, they can emulate creation, and perhaps even inspire it in others. The key to overcoming one's limitations and failings is to be continually tested by adversity, or so the Acolytes believe. The Circle of the Crone routinely push themselves to and beyond their limits with mortification, deprivation, isolation, and other ordeals that would make even other kindred cringe. Pain opens the door to new vistas and understandings, alters the senses, and possibly transforms the unchanging body of the acolyte into something new and even capable of creation. Ceremony is the basis of much of the Circle of the Crone's traditions. These vary from domain to domain, but a few are universal to the Covenant. Any gathering of the Circle of the Crone begins or ends with the recitation of the Crone's liturgy. The liturgy can be either spoken or sung, but it tells the tale of the Crone's determination after she was exiled by the gods. Given that the entire liturgy is quite long, most gatherings will restrict the liturgy to a few on-point selections before proceeding to business. The Circle of the Crone also has a busy calendar, and the most revered of these nights is the Winnowing, an annual rite occurring approximately at the same time as the winter solstice. The Winnowing is a time of personal reflection for an acolyte, of their actions during the year, and what they hope to accomplish in the year to come. During the Winnowing, each acolyte spills some of their blood on the earth in order to cleanse their spirits. At the end of the rite, the Hierophant crowns each acolyte with a laurel wreath, symbolizing their renewed connection to nature. Aside from the Winnowing, the Circle of the Crone celebrates the Feast of Samhain, honoring the Crone's departure from the world before winter with debauchery and blood feasts. Another important date is Latha Lunisdal, the Festival of Light, when the days begin to shorten and the nights grow longer. Another important date is Walpurgis Nacht. The acolytes prefer to use that night to embrace, as they associate it with May Eve, rather than the English Saint Walpurga. Last, but certainly not least, is the Panepsia Numenia, a feast to honor the Crone which can be marked by solemn contemplation or with a wild orgy of vampiric carnage. The signature power of the Circle of the Crone is known to the acolytes as Kruak, or the Bloody Crescent. As its name might suggest, it depends on the drawing of blood and the scarring of flesh, usually that of the kindred, but occasionally of a mortal victim. The actual practice draws heavily from a variety of shamanic traditions, which leads detractors to referring to the acolytes as witches. The acolytes, however, consider such comparisons to be insulting. The Circle has little use for titles apart from one official one, and invents such as they might need. That official title is that of the Hierophant. When 3 or more acolytes are in a domain, one of their number is appointed to serve as the high priest of the local circle, the Hierophant. The Hierophant chairs meetings and leads rites for all acolytes within a domain. Even when a Hierophant is retired from their office, they are still afforded the title as a matter of respect for their spiritual development. The Hierophant also bears the duty of developing the theology of the local acolytes. So if the Circle draws on Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Zoroastrian, Native American, Voodoo, Celtic, Norse, or some other set of beliefs to inform their practice, it is likely due to the Hierophant's guidance or preference. New members of the Covenant are collectively referred to as the Chorus. Being in the Covenant is something of an apprenticeship period, where they are guided along the path to thinking like an acolyte and accepting the rites of the Circle of the Crone. The Chorus also marks the last point at which a convert can withdraw from the Covenant without too much of a problem. But once a member of the Chorus is fully inducted into the Circle of the Crone, there is no backing out. The Invictus. To those of a Carthian or unbound persuasion, the Invictus are the patricians of the damned, the ones who have a stranglehold on the dance macabre, being that they are, according to themselves, the oldest covenant. Whether it is true or not, they certainly have the money, connections, and the will to power to position themselves as the true conservators of the masquerade. It is no accident that the Invictus style themselves as the First Estate. They arose as the Western Roman Empire fell. What replaced the greatest civilization in human history was feudalism, a political arrangement based on oaths of fealty, service, obedience, and protection. The Lord pledges to protect and support the vassals, and the vassals swear to serve, defend, and obey their lord. Equal parts contract law, military alliance, and survival of the fittest. Every Invictus kindred is a king or aspires to be one. For the Invictus, power is the only currency that matters, and there are only two groups of people, those who have it and those who serve it. But the Invictus do not accept the presuppositions of those who blithely disregard them as some degenerate aristocracy. Among the First Estate, titles and honors are fence lines and boundary markers. Among them, you eat what you kill. A kindred with ambition, ruthlessness, and cunning deserves to amass power. An Invictus prince rarely inherits a throne. They take one, whether it is from their sire, their sire's sire, or another vampire. For the most part, once a vampire is at the top, they are rarely dislodged, and those who show too much of their teeth to their betters will often get them pulled out. That's the funny thing about elders. They have more experience, more resources, and fewer scruples when it comes to the dance macabre. Elders even plan their torpors with exceeding care, extracting oaths of allegiance and setting their most loyal retainers in places of power before the long sleep finally claims them. That is part of the Invictus appeal to younger kindred. There are just enough crumbs to fall off the table to imagine the feast atop it. And a wise lord rewards good service, but not so much that a vassal gets ideas. It is a careful juggling act to keep the elders who have power in power forever, while letting kindred with talent rise, but not so high as to threaten those who are already at the top, and never without indebting themselves along the way. The First Estate has its roots in feudalism, and for the most part prefers to rule its domains along the same lines as they have for centuries. However, more innovative Invictus have incorporated newer models of organization and management, though with no less of an eye towards absolute control. The offices and mechanisms may change, but power is the ultimate goal. To that end, the Invictus are ruthless enforcers of the traditions, something they have in common with the Lancea Sanctum, though their purposes are different. For as much as those outside of the Invictus might piss and moan about the Covenant's oppression, wiser kindred who have existed long enough to witness just how depraved and monstrous their kind can be are worried that perhaps the Invictus are in the right, that without the iron law of the traditions, the kindred would descend into chaos and destruction. To the surprise of few, the Invictus are the covenant of elder kindred, especially those of clans Deva and Ventru respectively. But the First Estate has its share of ancilla and neonates scrambling about, learning the game of power from those who have played since horses were the main means of transportation. For the most part, this is due to circumstance. Children are obliged to serve and obey their sires until they are released, and Invictus sires make sure to squeeze every last drop of service from their progeny. Most neonates who are sired by Invictus vampires remain in the Covenant, either out of familiarity or because they have won some small place for themselves, or they are arrogant enough to believe that they can win at the game, given enough time. And the elders are content to feed the fires of ambitions in their lessers. After all, a king needs his knights and pawns, and a captain rarely pulls his own oars. There is power in numbers. The Covenant has its salespeople who can make the Invictus look like the streets are paved with gold, all while glossing over the shit you have to step in to get there. Joining the Invictus is surprisingly easy. A kindred presents themselves to the leader of the Covenant and swears an oath of loyalty, and that's it. Of course, just because you join doesn't mean you're on the inside. New members have to prove themselves before they get to learn the company's secrets, a process that can take years or even decades. This period is also a kind of apprenticeship, or if you really like degradation, an unpaid internship, where you learn the rules and the unwritten rules of the Invictus. Those who think they are entitled to power, or who like to cut corners, or worst of all, think that the rules don't apply to them, are in for a short career within the First Estate. The guiding principle of the Invictus is that power should rest in the hands of those best suited to wield it. It is only a happy coincidence that those hands are typically found among the First Estate. But why? Look at the great mass of kindred, bloodthirsty, insecure, treacherous, and half-mad. Quite frankly, kindred need to be ruled, perhaps more so than even mortals, which is why the Invictus seek to collect power within their own covenant. To be an Invictus of merit means to advance one's own interests while advancing the Covenant's at the same time. To be lacking in either capability or initiative is to condemn yourself to an eternity of servitude. One of the unwritten rules of the Covenant is that the Invictus must be respected. The First Estate are experts in cloak and dagger politicking. However, they also know the value in brand recognition, or propaganda. The Invictus have an expertise in flying its banners, projecting its power, and broadcasting its victories, while adhering to the traditions, of course. Publicity inspires confidence in the Invictus followers and uncertainty in its enemies. Everybody loves a winner, even when they hate him. One point that distinguishes the Invictus from the other Covenants is that the Invictus demand loyalty to the Covenant above all other things, sire, clan, or coterie. Another is that the First Estate regards mortals as the primary source of power, and several billion kine is a lot of power, as they make both excellent swords and shields. That's why the Invictus expends such effort to gain control of mortal power centers. Given the Invictus' focus on temporal power and realpolitik, the Covenant in general wastes little time on mysticism or rituals, but they strictly observe formalities unique to the First Estate, particularly the Oath of Fealty. The oath is the cost of doing business within the Invictus. Where they rule, they extract these oaths from kindred outside of their covenants. Most Invictus kindred are bound by several oaths of fealty. Another tradition passed down through the centuries of Invictus rule is the recitation of lineage. Despite their claims to merit, the Invictus, and the Ventru in particular, consider it declassed to be unable to recite one's lineage of blood several vampires back. Of course, a vampire's reception in Invictus domains can change, depending on the fame, or infamy, of one's forebears. As a tribute to its feudal lineage, the Invictus are sticklers for protocol and formality. At the bare minimum, this means observation of titles, recognition, and in some instances, specific wardrobe, whether it is a business suit or silk hose and tunics. In Invictus domains, status is everything. Failure to show proper deference to one's superiors is a good way to be shunned or punished. Showing too much regard for an inferior leads to mockery. And more than one upstart has tried to play the upstart, shouting how they won't do what they're told. And their defiance was answered with a severe beating if they're lucky. For the unlucky, there is the blood bond or banishment. And for the really unlucky, they get to meet the sun. Formalism is half the reason why the Elder Invictus prefer pre-electronic means of communication. The other half is that they don't entirely understand emails or even telephones, and are disinclined to trust the things. And yes, it's easy to hit elders with the boomer joke, but keep in mind that the NSA exists and no one has ever wiretapped or hacked a messenger. Add on that some elders can write alphabets that only a handful of linguists would even recognize, let alone be able to read, and can speak languages that are extinct. And you'll find that elders are dealing with slower, but possibly more secure communications. Of course, this is for more formal, personal, or private messages. There is a difference between being old-fashioned and being stupid. Even elders who don't trust electronic communication still have a means of getting their information out. I mean, what is a fledgling for, if not to serve as your personal assistant? But arguing over who uses carrier pigeons versus cell phones is a little boring. But you know what's not boring? Dueling. Back in the good old days when two men of certain station had a dispute, they had an option besides running to the local lord. They would get out the sticks, or the swords, and whoever was left standing at the end was the one in the right. Now there's something to be said for swift resolutions of disputes. And the Invictus tradition of trial by combat, or monomacy, was less costly than decades of shadow war between rival lords. Now, the Invictus place a great deal of stock in titles and rank, and the local domain usually translates to rank in the Covenant. So if you find yourself talking to an Invictus prince, you are probably also talking to the head of the Covenant in that domain. Likewise for an Invictus primogen. However, the Invictus have their own internal governance that they keep from the eyes of outsiders called the Inner Circle. The Inner Circle is usually created in domains where the Invictus do not hold power and functions as something akin to a parallel government, an organizational weapon whose purpose is to advance the interests of the Invictus and to infiltrate the domain. As mentioned earlier, members of the First Estate occasionally cannot resolve their disputes amicably and refuse to air their dirty laundry to inferior covenants. After all, unity is power. However, monomacy tends to be reserved for disputes in which one party has to meet final death for the matter to be settled. The Invictus have an official known as the Eudix, who serves as mediator and arbiter. The decision of the Eudix is binding on the Invictus in dispute, regardless of rank. In large domain, the Eudix is a standing position within the Invictus power structure. Elsewhere, the office is filled on an ad hoc basis by a respected kindred with no ties to either party. When a domain is small, a Eudix appoints their successor in the next matter. The Lancea Sanctum. The Lancea Sanctum, to their thinking, are the priesthood of the damned. Just as Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles, so Longinus, who pierced the side of Jesus Christ and was cursed with vampirism, became apostle to the kindred. The sanctified, their term for themselves, are God's holy monsters on earth who bear his message to the unknowing and his wrath to those who violate the covenant's tenets. The Lancea Sanctum are as respected as they are feared. If the Invictus are the aristocracy of the damned, then the Lancea Sanctum are its ecclesiarchy. They speak on behalf of God, a higher authority than any Invictus can claim. For their part, the Invictus choose to incorporate the sanctified in an advisory role with strong input on matters dealing with the traditions. The Invictus may think of the Lancea Sanctum as advisors where the Invictus hold domain, but when the Lancea Sanctum speak, it is usually not a suggestion. It is typically a strongly worded petition bordering on an ultimatum. They are gifted at persuasion and rhetoric and would rather convince other kindred of the rightness of their way of thinking. But the sanctified are keenly aware that their covenant was born in blood and on the point of a spear. When violence must be used, whether in self-defense or service to the covenant, the sanctified can and will send their enemies to final death. But generally the sanctified use the word first and the sword second. After all, God's mercy is infinite, but his patience is finite. To outsiders, the Lancea Sanctum are terrifying. All vampires are monsters, but the sanctified elevate their predation to a holy calling. Hunting, feeding, killing are sacred and necessary acts. The beasts of the field feed on the grass, the mortals feed upon the beasts, and the vampires feed upon the kine. A kindred has no right to even pretend to be mortal anymore. Most of the sanctified are not malevolent in their killing. In fact, they are downright pragmatic and sometimes unemotional about it. That they regard mortals as nothing more than animals to be run down only makes them more fearsome. The Lancea Sanctum tend to draw from vampires of all ages. Elders join the sanctified in search of meaning and spiritual enlightenment. Those who have tasted secular power and found that it did not satisfy the hunger of their souls. They crave some higher purpose than skulking in the shadows, feeding in the dark, and jockeying with their peers in a game that seems to have no winners. The Testament of Longinus provides these elders with some answers and tantalizes them with the promise of yet more. By contrast, younger converts to the Lancea Sanctum do not join the covenant in search of answers to deep theological questions. Instead, they join because the sanctified tells them that they are monsters and that God means for them to behave as such, though there are neonates with religious beliefs who find that the sanctified are close enough to the doctrines they held in life. Joining the Lancea Sanctum requires obedience to God, to his dark prophet Longinus, and the covenant that interprets and enforces their will. The sanctified are, to steal a phrase from the Blues Brothers, on a mission from God, not because they are vampires, but because they adhere to the teachings of Longinus. The Lancea Sanctum proselytize to non-believers, provide aid, and seek converts, in order to bring about the night when all kindred revere the founder Longinus as a prophet, and worship God. Longinus is crucial not because he gained followers or set rules, but because he was, in essence, a sin-eater, and that his punishment for breaking the sacred flesh of Christ was a crime that merited punishment. The Lancea Sanctum who follow him are devoted in that extreme, and adhere to the laws of the covenant as strictly as if they were handed down from God Almighty. According to the Sanctified, the traditions are inviolate, generally. The Lancea Sanctum honor the traditions as a tool to honor Longinus and bring other kindred closer to understanding their founder. So, the Sanctified enforce the traditions even as they embrace progeny. They convert other vampires to their covenant and neutralize or destroy those who threaten their goals. In other words, the good of the covenant creates an exemption by which members may embrace and murder as needed to ensure the Lancea Sanctum's continued survival. They are already damned, as Longinus was damned for proving Christ's divinity by piercing his side. The one tradition that none of the Sanctified will permit to be violated is the tradition of secrecy, the masquerade. Of course, some of the Sanctified take the tradition of secrecy as a license to destroy anyone who might be a witness to their activities, but the leadership of the covenant disapproves of such bloody-handedness to the point of disciplining the offending parties. However, they are content to make examples of egregious offenders rather than chase every errant neonate. One of the strictures of the Lancea Sanctum is that members are obliged to give spiritual guidance to kindred who have questions or require clarification. Of course, this rule is tempered by reason. The Sanctified are not obliged to allow armed enemies into their presence, nor to halt their efforts in the heat of battle to engage in theological debate. The Lancea Sanctum is the priesthood of all kindred, and so they advise their fellow kindred. It is through providing counsel and aid that the Sanctified gain converts. The Lancea Sanctum are not a pacifist priesthood. They gladly spill blood when necessary, but they do not force others to convert to the covenant at sword point, for it is simply impractical. The converted kindred, if their joining was false, would have to be watched constantly to prevent them from fleeing at the first opportunity. However, those who exist in domains beneath the cross of the Sanctified, if they do not believe, they will certainly be made to behave as if they did. The Sanctified enforce their traditions in such a way as to ensure that they do. Moving on, the Lancea Sanctum boasts more rituals than most factions of kindred, mortals, or even other supernaturals. The Requiem of the Sanctified is steeped in observance and tradition, though there are differences between domains and even coteries. The Sanctified claim that God has blessed them with miracles. However, their miracles are a form of blood magic which traces its origins to the formation of the covenant in the city of Thebes during the 3rd century, purportedly taught to the Christian soldiers of the Roman legion by an angel during their march from Thebes to Gaul. Whatever its origins, Theban sorcery is a powerful and demanding tool of the Lancea Sanctum. However, one does not just join the Lancea Sanctum for Theban sorcery. To become one of the Sanctified, they must be reborn within the covenant. This induction is known as the creation rite, and it is an outright violation of the traditions, though one that celebrates the birth of a new Sanctified and punishes their sire for damning a mortal soul. The rite calls for prayers, litanies, and an anointment in blood. Then they pass beneath the brand, a burning brand which does not scorch the damned's flesh but simply passes over their head. The sire, on the other hand, must bear the brand on their chest. This is their penance for cursing another. When the creation rite is complete, the child rises as one of the Sanctified. The brand is only the most common of penances for creation. Some sires are flogged, staked, or made to face the sun for a moment. Whatever the price, it must be paid by the sire. When one of the Sanctified joins the covenant or advances in rank, an anointing is performed either by a priest or some other official recognized within the covenant. It is a formal call and response. The newly advanced Sanctified is asked a series of questions or told their duties and accepts them with a ritual response. The supplicant kneels and is anointed with blood, symbolizing their new rank, a seal that they are forbidden from removing until the next night. But some Sanctified like to anoint with a bit more blood, specifically with a bloodbath. Rather than marking the supplicant with a few touches of blood, they are drenched in it or immersed in it. Those who frenzy are deemed unworthy and their advancement is withdrawn. Those who maintain their composure prove their fitness to lead. Elders Sanctified forbid the bloodbath, generally as a perversion of an older rite of the covenant, but it is supported by younger priests who regard it as a ceremony with value, even if the cost of preparing the bloodbath poses a threat to the masquerade. The Midnight Mass is one of the most important rites of the Lancea Sanctum. Its frequency varies depending on the domain and the duties of its bishop, but it occurs at least once a month, or as often as every night. Attendance is not mandatory, but it is, let's say, expected, and too many absences are made note of. The Lancea Sanctum has its own hierarchy, some offices which overlap with the power structure of a domain. The bishop is the leader of the Lancea Sanctum in a given domain. As the shepherd of the sanctified, they are responsible for the spiritual unlife therein, as the highest authority. Many princes take care to incorporate the bishop into their regime in some office of suitable honor and power, to keep the sanctified appeased. A bishop is responsible for the spiritual development of the sanctified and coordinates the activities of the damned in that domain. When one of the sanctified rule a domain, they usually reject the temporal title of prince in favor of that of archbishop. Archbishops typically do not serve as bishops. Few vampires can manage the duties of running a domain and the covenant simultaneously. Technically, the archbishop outranks the bishop, but a wise archbishop countermands the bishop infrequently. Some archbishops are powerful enough and lead large enough flocks to claim the title of cardinal, though it is not one formally recognized by the covenant. Essentially, it is how powerful sanctified let their fellow damned know who has the biggest, mitre. The teachers of the covenant hold the title of priest, though their particular authority varies. Priests with official recognition from the local bishop are afforded more respect, especially from the prince and their flunkies. But most priests are knowledgeable laymen who guide the spiritual development of their coteries. And the duty of hunting heretics, miscreants, and traitors falls to the sanctified's inquisitors. The inquisitors have the authorization to investigate anyone within the covenant, and where the Lancea Sanctum holds authority in a domain, not even other covenant's vampires are safe. In other instances, the inquisitors often clash with the domain's sheriff over jurisdiction. Most bishops and archbishops who have authority over the inquisitors are cautious about loosing them on non-sanctified vampires, and will at least request the leave of the local prince before any inquiries are opened, or dispatch an inquisitor who is discreet. The Ordo Dracul. Curses have power, and the embrace is one of the most dire curses in existence. However, curses can be circumvented, twisted, and even broken. The covenant known as the Ordo Dracul, the Order of the Dragon, believes that it can surpass and perhaps even transcend the curse of vampirism through intellect and resolve. The name of the covenant is not a coincidence. The founder is none other than the legendary voivode of Wallachia, Vlad III, the Impaler Prince, Dracula. He claims to have not been sired. Instead, he was cursed by God for his sins, his cruelty, his depravity, and his betrayal of his holy oaths to defend Christendom for the sake of gaining power. But Dracula is not a mythical figure. In fact, he was last seen only a century before. However, he has been surrounded by unusual circumstances. The Covenant grew based on the discoveries of Dracula concerning the vampire curse. The reverence for Dracula among the Ordo Dracul is different than the Lancea Sanctum's near worship of Longinus. There is no finality, no permanence, not even in the living death of vampirism. Granted, no kindred is known to have escaped from the Requiem, not even Dracula, but members of the Covenant have progress to show for their efforts, and that supports their belief that transcendence can be achieved, even if it takes centuries or millennia. The principle guiding the Ordo Dracul is simple: the transcendence of the vampiric condition. The Carthians and the Invictus chase political power. The Lancea Sanctum and the Circle of the Crone seek to beseech their remote and chthonic gods respectively for their favor. Potential dragons feel a yearning for fulfillment that cannot be satisfied by gaining temporal power over mortals or other kindred, nor by abasing themselves before the divine. The Ordo Dracul offers power and liberation through self-mastery, and what vampire would not want to escape from the burdens of undeath? The Ordo Dracul draws from vampires of all clans. Ultimately, intellect and ability count for more than lineage in this covenant. but the dragons do not accept anyone who comes knocking to their doors. The Ordo Dracul does not actively recruit new members. Usually, one is invited to join the Covenant after investigating the dragons and testing the limits of vampirism on their own. Once a neonate finds a dragon willing to mentor them, they become apprentices and are subsequently initiated. Ordo Dracul initiations are typically highly elaborate affairs which test the minds and spirits of the would-be novices. Learning the coils of the dragon requires one to surrender themselves fully to study and experimentation. If a mentor decides that their pupil is unable to develop further or is too slow to learn, their lessons stop and the apprentice is unceremoniously expelled from their mentor's presence, or simply abandoned. An apprentice can continue to study and practice on their own, but grasping the mysteries of the coils of the dragon is nearly impossible without guidance. Dracula, the founder and namesake of the Ordo Dracul, was cursed by God himself with vampirism. This event, while wondrous, is not exactly unique. After all, the Lancea Sanctum claimed that their founder was similarly afflicted by the Almighty. However, the Ordo Dracul acknowledged that they are the product of divine malediction and no more. Their philosophy owes more to the ritual occultism of the late 19th century, and the Covenant does function along similar lines to the secret societies popularized during the same period. Most importantly, there is demonstrable power in learning of the Ordo Dracul's teachings and the observance of its rituals. Only the youngest of the Ordo Dracul consider themselves to be immortal. True, a vampire may theoretically exist forever under ideal conditions, are just that, theoretical. No kindred exists without enemies. Every vampire can burn. Immortality is not invulnerability, and nothing lasts forever. Even the kindred are not perfectly static. Why else does their blood change as they age? Why else are their forms mutable? Why are they still capable of learning? Change is ultimately to the good, even when it is ultimately destructive, because it reminds dragons that nothing is immutable, and to learn what they can from the cycles of creation and destruction, if only to avoid meeting a similar fate. The Ordo Dracul's obsession with change is not born out of novelty but necessity. Every dragon must remember that despite their great power and learning, they are ultimately cursed creatures. But their studies are not for the sake of returning to humanity, but rather evolving into something greater than a vampire. Enlightenment comes through knowledge of causality. Every action must be taken with purpose, and every reaction foreseen and accounted for. Power without planning ultimately turns towards mindless destruction of the kindred and any unfortunate who happens to be around them. Only fools mistake chaos for change. The spine of the Ordo Dracul is the relationship between mentor and protege, and those relationships vary greatly. Some mentors prefer to cloister their disciples and force them to engage in repetitive rote learning or other routine tasks until the mentor deems them worthy to learn the deeper mysteries. Others are a bit looser, leaving their charges to study and appearing to them infrequently to assess their progress, offer some obscure guidance, or chastise them for their failure to grasp some previous teaching. Many dragons introduce themselves as the disciple of their mentor, or, if a dragon is well respected, their mentor may introduce themselves as their protege's mentor, sort of how the Emperor Heraclius' father is known as Heraclius the Elder. The Ordo Dracul gives its strongest members the title of Guardian, and assigns them the duty of protecting the nexuses and ley lines. Guardians are typically skilled in combat and subterfuge, and while they will gladly kill to protect magic sites held by the Ordo Dracul, they will rarely die for them. The reason for sending the Covenant's heavy hitters to guard the mystical sites is threefold. First, to keep them out of the hands of the ignorant and the unworthy, a net which catches the circle of the Crone, the Lancea Sanctum, the Awakened, the werewolves, and pretty much anyone who isn't part of the Ordo Dracul. Second, a nexus is a resource, and a resource in your hand is one denied to your enemies. Effectively, the magician equivalent of squatting. As a corollary, the dragons reason that the other covenants may try to destroy the magic sites, knowing of their value to the Ordo Dracul, simply out of spite. Third, mystical sites are not static. Power is dynamic, and the dragon is always in motion. Some sites grow in power while others decline. The dragons reason that the sooner they know about any changes, the easier it is for them to plan accordingly. This movement of energies is why guardians need not sacrifice their unlives in defense of nexuses. The power will eventually re-emerge somewhere else. The Kogayan is the foremost guardian of a domain, a Thracian term meaning the magnificent's head. This dragon is the keeper of the lists of local members of the Ordo Dracul, as well as the maps of nearby ley lines and registers of artifacts. Most Kogayan prefer to memorize this information or encode it to prevent outsiders and unworthies from discovering it. While being elevated to Kogayan is an honor, it effectively isolates one from the rest of the Covenant. No other dragon wants to associate with such a high-profile target of the Covenant's enemies. If a Kogayan was not a hermit before their ascension, they will become one soon after. Transcendence is at the core of the Ordo Dracul's philosophy, and mastery of the same allows a dragon to bypass certain difficulties of the kindred condition. Some dragons can decrease their need for blood through mastery of the vampiric metabolism, or subsist on animal blood rather than human blood. Overcoming the limits of the vampire condition must, inevitably, lead to the escape from vampirism itself, to whatever higher state awaits the Ordo Dracul. They call this set of masteries the coils of the dragon. The hierarchy of the Ordo Dracul is impenetrable to outsiders, but the dragon's tongue is the forked path by which kindred master the secrets of their undead state and gain power. All dragons reach a point in their development in which they must specialize their knowledge. What distinguishes the dragon's tongue from the coils of the dragon is that the former deals with one's rank within the Covenant, while the latter is a measure of one's potential or skill. In the world, there are places of mystical power, and the Ordo Dracul name these places as holy, or dragon nests. However, they are a bit like oil. They tend to move around under the earth. Old places of power run dry and new places spring forth to replace them. Superstitious mortals tend to call these places haunted. The dragons keep careful charts of where they are located, where they were, and where they might go. This bit of arcane cartography is considered both a ritual and an honor in the Covenant. Those who are sent to excavate these sites and discover some artifact is permitted to keep whatever they find. A lesson in practical knowledge that has gained popularity among the Ordo Dracul is known as following the dragon's tail. A mentor instructs their pupil to kill one mortal while feeding, and then trace the chain of events resulting from that death. Who discovered the mortal's body? Who came to claim the corpse? How were they buried? Who attended their funeral? Did the police investigate? If so, how much? Who mourned for the dead? What did they do? Supposedly, the first dragon to perform this experiment is still tracking the results, over 200 years later. The point of the lesson, insofar as it can be said to have one, is to take every possible result into consideration, however seemingly trivial or distant that result may be. Another meaning for following the dragon's tail is to tie up the loose ends of one's plans. The Unaligned. Surprising as it may be, not every vampire is content to bow and scrape to the elders until it is their turn to rule, if that night should ever come. These radical kindred individualists have had the names Unaligned or Unbound affixed to them by their opponents, but each renounces the rule of elder and covenant alike. The Unaligned are not a band of plucky young rebels or an underground movement. Any kindred who rejects the dance macabre, who shuns the ranks and strictures of covenants, and ignores the stations of regents and princes, is considered, by default, to be unaligned. The unaligned have been on the fringes of kindred society for nearly as long as there have been kindred. Occasionally they have been called autarchus, or anarchs, due to their disregard for the commands and laws of their supposed betters. Still, death did nothing to stymie these vampires' rather libertarian desire to simply be left alone. And for most kindred history, all but the most tyrannical princes were content to allow these asocial unaligned to brood in solitude. Then some things happened. Too many vampires were unaligning from the dance macabre, and the elders decided to shut all of this nonsense about an unaligned movement right down. However, the unaligned draw from an unusual cross-section of the kindred. Naturally, Neonates without resources, patronage, or will to power decide to check out of the whole rotten game, at least for a while. Further up the food chain are the ancilla, those who have been outplayed at the game or realized that they were sold off pieces of their own souls for little gain, the walking casualties of the dance macabre, outcasts, failures, and trash. But there are a handful of unaligned of elder vintage, particularly Gangrel and Mekket, who yearn for freedom from the shackles of power. Other elders seek to use the unaligned as a sort of pseudo-covenant, a new power base loyal to them alone. Still, there is a certain level of expectations that comes with age and power, and elders have ways of bringing their wayward peers back into line and disabusing them of such whimsical notions as freedom. A vampire is, in their souls, alone. They are forever barred from mortal society in the same way that wolves can never truly join a flock of sheep. They are condemned to forever exist at the margins of humanity, entering only so long as they need to get what they want. But mortal society is a land from which they are unhappy exiles. Kindred society is an oxymoron at best, and a shackle forged by the elders to keep younger vampires obedient. Solitary predators are rarely sociable, and the unaligned find enforced sociability to be a prelude to tragedy. The best path to harmony among kindred is the same as among tigers. Let each keep to his own domain and lair, respect the territory of others, and stay out of one another's way. If power corrupts the living, then how much more so the undead? Despite some vampire claims of elevation over the muck of humanity, the kindred have their own needs, appetites, and a lust for power that can stretch into eternity. And no mortal must contend with the beast. For these reasons, the unaligned generally reject the idea of submitting to organizations and hierarchies. After all, where can the damned lead the damned except further into hell? On the other hand, power is like God. Even if you don't believe in power, it still believes in you. And the only way to defend yourself from power is with power of your own. But the unaligned are not hermits. Being a vampire may be a solitary road, but pretending other vampires simply don't exist is folly. So the unbound walk a precarious balance between protecting their own interests while avoiding unnecessary interference with other kindred. To that end, most content themselves to acquire power among mortals rather than vampires. And those were the 5 covenants, plus 1 non-covenant, of Vampire the Requiem. I admit that my preference is for Masquerade over Requiem, as some of you may have figured out. However, the covenants demonstrate a bit more nuance and development of vampire factionalism than the 2 great superpowers of the Masquerade, being the Camarilla and the Sabbat. The 5+ covenants of Requiem are particularly new inventions. The Carthians are the anarchs with more discipline and chronological snobbery. The Invictus are the Camarilla, the Masquerade version, not the Requiem one, which is a separate organization and a slightly smaller budget. The Lancea Sanctum are, curiously enough, the Sabbat with more Christianity and less murder hoboing, the Circle of the Crone are the Bahari with slightly more structure, and the Ordo Dracul is a combination of the Oradia League and the Khulduns, only not quite so Tzimisce. Anyway, that's all I have for now. Until next time.